Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this afternoon's GRCI Law and IT Governance panel discussion on last year's privacy and cybersecurity lessons and how to prepare for what looks as though it will be an even more unpredictable 2022. Just before we start, a couple of housekeeping items. You will all note that you are muted as you come into the session. That's to save you the problem of having to mute yourself, but also to try and avoid background noise and so on, which can be quite disruptive for everybody. If you have specific questions which you would like us to answer and which we'll tackle in the second part of the session, please do submit them through preferably the chat function in WebEx. You can access that all through the control panel sat on the bottom right-hand side of your WebEx screen, or through the Q&A panel. That's an alternative. Prefer the chat because that's easier for all of us. Simply type your message in, and when we get to it, I'll read the question out and share that with the panel, and then one or more of us will answer it. The question I know everybody always asks is, will we get a copy of the slides? The answer is yes. We'll share a copy of the presentation slides and the recording, which we'll send out in the course of tomorrow to everybody who is a delegate on this session. So just to introduce the panel, there are three of us today. I'm Alan Calder. I'm the Chief Executive of the GRC International Group and of IT Governance. John Potts, who's the Operations Director of GRCI Law, and Cliff Martin, who is our Cyber Incident Response Lead in GRCI Law. GRCI Law is a business we set up some 4 years ago and is a specialist in privacy, in data protection, in cyber incident response, and all the things that go with a legal and compliant way of dealing with today's challenges. As a group, we have 15 years of experience. We're now about 200 full-time members of staff. We've delivered services of one sort or another to about 12,000 clients across 6 continents. And our focus is, of course, IT governance, risk and compliance solutions. It's very much a focus around helping organizations develop defense in depth to help them deal with the breadth and complexity of today's cyber and privacy challenges. And we do quite a lot of that through training, quite a lot of that through consultants, but also through a substantial range of platforms. And you can see on the screen a honeycomb which indicates the makeup of the group and the number of organizations which are inside it. The panel discussion today is going to focus on the key lessons to be learned from 2021's most notorious cyber attacks, the cybersecurity and data protection best organizations should adopt, and the challenges organizations face in 2022 and how to prepare for the unpredictable and unexpected. We're expecting the covering of this area will take about 30 to 35, 40 minutes, so we'll be left over with between 15 and 30 minutes to deal with questions that you might have for us. In terms of cyber incidents and data breaches, I think probably I'll give Cliff a chance to share his voice with you for the first time and just run through briefly these 4 most notorious breaches from last year. Cliff, would you like to pick that up?
Yeah, that's fine. So good afternoon to everybody. As you can see on the screen, so the 4 statistics there are just stats that we've taken from various websites. So the first one, so 61% of organizations were hit with a ransomware attack over the past 12 months. So that was from last year and the year before. So we'll talk about a bit about ransomware a bit more as we go through the presentation, but ransomware is becoming more and more popular, and you can see it. And there's a lot of criminal organizations which are going down that route, which organizations need to be aware of and consider as part of their incident response. The next one there, so 31% of organizations have a business continuity plan that covers cybersecurity. So that's quite a low number. Obviously, organizations need to have a plan, so if the worst is to happen, they can react very quickly, and also within an allocated cost. The next one there, so 48% rise in threat volume in the first year of the pandemic. So as organisations had to adapt to the pandemic, a lot of people tend to work from home, which obviously brought its own challenges and the reduced workload from IT departments, ensuring that everybody had access to company data and they were still able to do their work. And then the final one there, so 25% of businesses have cybersecurity policies that cover home working. So 25% is still quite a low number considering the pandemic happened. Organisations still need to adapt and they need to make sure that they have their policies and procedures in place that do cover home working and the sort of things that we'll cover as part of this presentation. Thanks, Alan.
Thank you, Cliff. So we pulled together from feedback ahead of the webinar a number of questions from some of you on the webinar. First one, what are the current challenges organizations face and how can they prepare for an unpredictable and unexpected 2022? I've got some views on that, but John, would you like to have a first stab at some of the challenges organizations have got?
Thanks, Alan. Good afternoon, everybody. One of the themes that's going to run through this entire presentation that we're going to do, all this discussion, are going to be preparation, training and practice. And I think the challenges that organizations have now is that we've seen this working from home has blossomed quite rightly, lots of people working from home. That brings its own challenges that certainly we've found within the data breach area that I cover, where organizations are no longer under threat just within the confines of their own buildings, but now they've got challenges where working from home, staff using their own devices, bringing their own device to work, we know all the pitfalls that go with that. We've got into a routine now with working from home, but organizations across all sectors, because I have heard it said in the past couple of months, seriously, only in the past couple of months, certainly we won't be attacked. We won't be party to an attack because we are a charity. Why would anybody attack a charity? Well, speak to the charities that have been attacked and you'll see that that's going to happen. The challenges I think that people have are to know what you have. We'll talk later on about preparing for that, but to know what data you have, know where the data is, know who has access to it, know what security is in place on that data at every stage of where it is. The challenge now is that that's expanded outside of the workplace. Challenge is also that on the stats that we've just seen, the increase in ransomware attacks, I think the stat that was probably not there is the amount of organizations that are attacked twice, 3 times, that pay the ransom and then get attacked again. So the current challenges that I can see is homeworking and knowing where your data is at any one time and being prepared for those threats. Cliff, I don't know if you would add to that on the cyber side.
The only thing I would highlight, I don't know, Alan's probably got a view on this as well, is rightly so. So you were talking about home working. One thing that businesses do need to consider is that the traditional boundary of the business network is increased. You know, it's very difficult to draw a line around your business IT and where the border between the home and the business lies. It's about having those policies and procedures in place that to ensure that people do have that separation between business and their home IT, and you know, and looking at the risks associated with either, you know, things like kids at home and that sort of thing, and having access to or visibility of any business related activities. Yeah, that's what goes hand in hand. Yeah.
As you say,
I think that's right.
Sorry, Alan.
I think that's right, Cliff, and I think John, what you're saying is correct. The expansion in the perimeter, in the organizational perimeter, means that from an attacker's point of view, the attack surface has got so much broader. And I'm sure that the most common thing that we hear from our clients who've been breached is they didn't expect it to happen to them. And I think one of the things that most organizations should pay a lot of attention to as we go into 2022 is the massive increase in professionalism and sophistication in cyber criminals. We've gone over the last couple of years from cybercrime being a a fairly amateur operation to being something which is highly sophisticated, employing some very bright people, using some very sophisticated technology and sophisticated processes for attacking organizations. We've moved on from, one or two people who are attacking a small number of organizations to organized crime gangs who quite often interface with nation states who are able to draw down on technologies put together by Russia, by North Korea, by Iran, and deploy those in ways that are wholly unexpected. And when you see the closed down the colonial pipeline breach in the US, the attacks on hospitals across the EU, the attack just over the weekend by a Belarusian hacking organization on their own state infrastructure because they're against Lukashenko and against the idea of being involved possibly in attack on the Ukraine. The range of activities has just expanded at the same time as the attack surface has expanded. So organizations who might have gone without, as far as they're aware, being attacked for the last 5 or 10 years are almost certainly going to find themselves in the middle of something going wrong in the course of the next year. Cliff, I don't know if you want to add anything to that.
I don't think so. I think you've covered it with this one. Yeah, we'll talk a lot about the key lessons and the types of controls in just a sec, I think.
So let's do exactly that. The key lessons organizations need to learn from 2021's most notorious cyber attacks. Cliff, do you want to lead on that?
Yeah, can do. So just continuing on from what Alan was saying before. So he did mention a couple of high profile attacks, the colonial pipeline, the ransomware on the HSE that happened last year as well. As the year progressed, there were different types of attacks, but the ones that kept reoccurring, the ones that kept going in the news. So it was things like data breaches and ransomware was the double extortion. So where an attacker will go onto a network, pull data off, but also then encrypt. So it's another way of persuading the victim to pay the ransom by saying, I've got your data, I'm going to release it. And we've also started to see a lot of attackers go through that data and try to pull out things which are very sensitive and could have a huge impact for organizations. Things like, business acquisitions, business mergers, anything that's sensitive that could affect the organizations, share prices, that sort of thing. Attackers are starting to look for those and starting to use those as their way to influence the victim from pain. So with that, another one that I should also mention, sorry, just before I move on. So I'm sure we all remember the SolarWinds attack, but also Microsoft Exchange as well. So we're starting to see a lot more supply chain attacks happening as well. So these are organizations which are outside of the business you're protecting, but it's organizations that you have a trust in or a dependency to deliver services to your organization. You don't necessarily have control over their cybersecurity, but you do have a vested interest that they are doing the right thing. And we'll cover this a bit more, but we'll start to see that a bit more, I believe. So some of the key lessons for me, and I'm sure Alan and John will have some as well. So John's mentioned about asset management, so understanding what your organization has. And I would go one step further as well and say that should include how it's configured as well. So one of the analogies, one of the terms that I like to hear is, how would you secure a building if you didn't know where all the doors and the windows were? It's the same with computer systems, networks. If you don't know what's happening or what's currently present on that network, how are you going to protect it? So asset management's a big one, and it's probably one of the most difficult ones as well. But it's something that we need to get better as a wider community. Another one is just general fundamentals of cybersecurity. So we're still seeing that cyber attackers are still going after the low-hanging fruit. So things like insecure networks, default passwords, those sort of things. So having a risk-based approach to cybersecurity from an organization perspective, understanding the context of your organization and applying controls based on what you need. So we've talked about the remote working, for example. Well, client devices connecting to your network, there's communication happening there. Simple things like encrypting the data. And I know it's quite easy for me to say you should just encrypt it, but having those mechanisms in place that protects the confidentiality, integrity, and availability of the business and the organization, applies that defense in depth approach as well. So looking at people, process, physical, technical controls across the whole piece. Another big one, and one that we do continue to see as well, is software patches, ensuring that software is up to date and ensuring that you do understand from an asset management perspective any dependencies. So the Log4j vulnerability that happened just before Christmas, that was obviously a 0-day in quite a common piece of software. Organizations quickly tried to put mitigations in place, and the office of the software also put out patches as well. But organizations need to understand where they have a dependency on that software, so then they can put their own mitigations in place based on the risks associated with the context of their organization. It's very easy for us to say, yeah, you should do this, that, and the other, but that might not necessarily apply to your organization and the environment that you have. Alan, John, I don't know if there's anything you to add.
I think picking up on the point you raised there, Cliff, about it might not be you, it's somebody else. Well, that somebody else may well be your processor.
Yeah.
Certainly some of the things that we've seen with clients is the fact that this highlights the relationship that they have with their processor. If your processor has been hacked and they've got access to your data, then have you got a robust contract in place with your processor to ensure that they are processing in a manner that you would process that data if it was yourself? So all of these things from a practical aspect, the massive cyber attacks that we've got, they've impacted on lots and lots of other organizations, smaller organizations that perhaps haven't got those contracts and the right thing in place. So everything within GDPR, I think, builds onto something else. And everything in data privacy builds onto something else, or is built on the back of something. So I think where there is a major cyber breach, everybody should look and think, what's our connection with that? What's that connection with that organization? Do we have a connection? Is it a third-party processor for somebody else? Have we got everything in place there? So that's the lessons that we're picking up from clients and passing out to clients. Have a look at the bigger picture.
And John, you're absolutely right. One of the key lessons of the last couple of years is that virtually every single cybersecurity incident is also a data breach. Almost invariably, personal data is compromised in a cyber incident, and that therefore means that under UK GDPR or EU GDPR, you're most certainly faced with having to report to a regulator about the breach. At the very least, you're faced with having to record and deal with it internally, even if your decision is that you don't need to report it to a regulator. And that means that you can no longer, in a real defense in depth environment, think about simply having a cyber incident response operation. It needs to be cyber incident response tied into GDPR data breach reporting, which understands how to report and manage the legal aspects of dealing with the breach, because the legal consequences of doing that wrong can be significant.
Exactly. And the other point there, Alan, that you raise is that organizations sometimes forget that a denial of service can constitute a breach as well. It's not just leaving your papers on the train or somebody reading over your laptop when you're in Costa. If your organization cannot get to its personal data because of a ransomware attack or whatever, that denial of service could well constitute a breach. So it's all feeding back into the data breach service, the data breach management, and everything else that goes with that. And we'll talk about how they jigsaw together later on in the discussion.
Yeah. And I'm with you completely. If somebody whose operation is postponed or whose health is compromised by data not being available on a healthcare system, it's a completely inadequate response for the hospital to say data wasn't compromised in the sense that it wasn't stolen or exfiltrated, because it simply wasn't available where it was needed, and that had a bad impact on somebody's health. So moving on to what are the cybersecurity and data protection best practices companies should adopt in 2022. How do companies, Cliff, thinking about some of the things you were talking about in terms of the lessons to be learned, how should those be deployed into best practice in the year ahead?
So yeah, so like I mentioned before, it's by having a look at the risks associated with the context and the environment that you work in, by applying those fundamental cybersecurity controls and ensuring that you do have the right policies, procedures in place, that you do know what you're doing, and so does your staff as well. Having those controls there just helps to mitigate the risks associated with potential attacks and the impact of those attacks. Yeah, John, I don't know if you've got anything.
I think for a lot of organisations, it's balancing the commercial considerations and the threat that goes with that. It's always a challenge for organisations to do that. We talked about making sure that training is up to date. We talked about know where your data is, know who's got it. Let's have the best practice of having your line of defence, if you like, right from the very, very onset. I was watching a programme last night, Warship, Life at Sea, something along those lines, and you've got one of the most sophisticated nuclear submarines in the world surfacing just off the coast of Scotland, and the defence in depth that the Royal Navy put together, which totally flummoxed the Russian Navy, was to get close in a frigate to the submarine and make a lot of noise. Because what that stopped happening was it meant that the Russians couldn't get a signature of the noise, and therefore they wouldn't be able to recognize it when it was in the middle of one of the oceans. That was their first line of defense, make a lot of noise. The best practice that companies can have in place is to make sure that you've got that defense in depth, that you're starting right at the very beginning. And I always say, whenever we do a gap analysis, my gap analysis starts if I'm going on site, when I drive into the car park and look for the sign that says CCTV is in operation here, this is where you need to contact, through to the reception desk. The best practice starts at your very, very first line of defense, and that's will run through the whole theme of defense against cyber incidents, linking into data breaches.
I'm completely with you, John. I think you've got to have policies and procedures. You've got to have staff training. You've got to have competent technical staff. You've got to have staff awareness training, which deals with phishing and cyber crime, secure working practices. You've got to have penetration testing across your internal and external infrastructure. You've got to patch. You've got to have proper password management policies. You've got to identify your key broader risks and deal specifically with those. You've got to manage security around assets. You've got to track assets. You've got to have your legal compliance processes in place. And all of that still has to recognize that breaches are going to happen. So you're going to find yourself managing cyber incidents, which means you've got to have, as part of what you talk about as defense in depth, you've got to have cyber incident response, and it's got to have a legal component to it so you can deal with the reporting. It should probably have a PR component in it so you can deal with the comms around breaches and how you talk to people internally and externally. But it's got to be something which recognizes the ability of cyber attackers to get through multiple levels of defense, and the reality that you've got human beings processing data, which means there's an opportunity for error, and that again means attackers have to be successful only once. They need to find just one hole, whereas as a defender you've got to be successful 100% of the time. You have to be able to block every single attack, and that means the attackers have the advantage. So defense in depth is the only core approach. It's the best practice, I think, for 2022. And before we move on to the next question, I don't know, Cliff, if you want to add anything to that.
I don't think so. I agree with everything you and John said then. Yeah, I think you've covered everything.
Agreement's always a good thing.
Yeah.
So before a cyber incident is detected, in terms of data privacy, what should an organization have in place? This feels, John, like a question for you. Thank you,
Alan. This sounds as if it should have a really simple answer. You need everything, but you've got it. Whatever you need, you've got to get in there, as we said. Talk about the warship making a lot of noise. What we found over the past 12 months, a bit longer than that, past 12, 18 months, is that the emphasis has shifted. We're seeing businesses that are faced with a movable workforce. As we said, the exterior of the workplace has moved. It's now in everybody's home. And the attitude of really, do we need these things in place now, or do we wait until we're hit? Well, I can tell you now, it's easier to do these things in your own time to get prepared than it is when the ICO comes at you and says, you will do this, end of. By the way, you've got 7 days to do it. It's easier to do that in your own time than to start to panic and to say, to my mind, and I say this to all the consultants and when we're discussing things, everything starts with knowing where your data is. Let's start with something which, and I love the fact that people say, yeah, let's do a simple Article 30 ROPA. Anybody who's been involved in producing an Article 30 or a ROPA will know there's nothing simple about it. But to go back to the point I raised before about everything builds on everything else, once you've started to do that Article 30, then you start to realize that you know where that data is. How is it being protected? Is it secure when it's at rest? Is it secure when it's moving? Where is it secured? Have we done a DPIA with this? If we're going to do a DPIA, that's going to highlight even more points. So we're building up all the time. We need to know where our data is, what's happening to it. Let's get that defense there. A training regime, I've dealt with literally hundreds of data breaches on behalf of clients and in my previous role, probably thousands actually in my previous role, but that's another story. One of the first questions the ICO will always ask is, what training had that person had that involved in that? Let's take it beyond the cyber incident. What training has that person had? If you can't answer that question, you're already on the back foot. If you can answer that question, the next question may well be, can you prove that? So you're going to need to have a training regime and a record of that training. Risk assessment, Recycle 71, without throwing articles and recyclers in, talks about a risk assessment. Is the board aware of where your risks are? We've built that from the Article 30. We've produced that from the DPIA. We're looking at risk assessment. So what should you have in place before a cyber incident happens is what you need for GDPR. What you have to have in place is policies, procedures, processes, because each one of those will say, whoa, hang on, that's a weak spot. We need to pick that up. If you've got a working from home policy, have you also got a policy regarding shredding? Have you got the right kind of shredder? These are the kind of things that you will pick up on your DPI. These are everyday things that my team pick up when we are advising clients and dealing with clients. So what do you need for data privacy before you have a cyber incident? Start with your Article 30 and build out from there.
John, for those of us who come to this from a cybersecurity background, just a brief description of what Article 30 is and the link between Article 30 and what a DPIA requires. What is a DPIA? What does it require?
Sorry, Alan. An Article 30, that's me getting carried away. An Article 30 is your record of processing activity. It basically is a list of every line of data that you have, if you will. What's your lawful reason for processing it? What's your retention period? Who's got access to it? Where is it stored? How long are you going to keep it if it's beyond the retention period? The DPIA, the Data Protection, Data Privacy Impact Assessment, talks about, there used to be a nice to have. Pre-GDPR, a DPIA was a nice to have. Post-GDPR, they're now a must to have. That may well change. There are discussions around that, but at the moment, a Data Protection Impact Assessment says, right, we're going to process personal data. Why are we going to process that personal data? What's our lawful reason for processing that personal data? Once we've decided on that, and we've got a lawful reason for processing it, how are we going to process it? So we're now going to do the how. What's our rationale? How are we going to do it? Are we going to share it with anybody? What's the risk associated with that, with doing that person, with processing that personal data. And if the risk is, and it can be something which may sound simple, it can be something as simple as, well, if that's printed off at home, and I go back to this because we've raised several points with previous clients, with clients quite recently, is if it needs to be printed off, how are we going to deal with that printing? Printing anything nowadays is a risk. But we can mitigate that risk by shredding it. We can mitigate it further by making sure we've got a cross-cut shredder. So the ROPA, the Article 30, is everything about your data, the who, the what, the when, the where, the how. And the DPIA is something that says, right, we're processing this data. Why are we going to do it? What are the risks? How are we going to mitigate it? Just very, very quickly, Alan, just to add to colleagues that there are some form of data processing where a DPIA is a legal requirement. So if we are talking about biometric data along those lines, you must get prior consent from the ICO before you actually start processing that data. Sorry, Alan, get carried away there with my acronyms.
Thanks, John. Cliff, you wanted to add something to that earlier on.
I was going to ask about the Article 30, which you jumped straight in. The only other bit that I think we just need to make sure it's clear, how does that correspond to different locations, John? So obviously we talked a lot about the ICO then. Obviously there's a lot of rules depending on the geographical location of the organisation. Is that correct?
Yeah, I think one of the things that people, and I'm not sure whether they're covering this in a later question, but if we do, I just blame you, Cliff. One of the things that people do forget, and I think Alan has brought the point out, is that every cyber incident is probably a data breach as well. We talk about reporting reporting data breaches. We've got the ICO report within 72 hours if there's a high risk to the rights and freedoms of the data subject. But that's not the same across Europe. So if you are dealing with data outside of the EU and even within the EU, there are different rules for reporting. Forgive me for looking at my other screen, but we know that, because I've got it in front of me. Serbia is 72 hours, Spain 72 hours, as you would expect. But in other countries, Malaysia's got no requirement to notify, but they're moving towards the GDPR model. The Australia says that you must report every data breach. Sorry, the UAE says you must report every data breach, no matter how big it is. So as we become a more global organization, as our clients are, that's something you need to be aware of. We've certainly dealt with breaches that have transcend continents, as Alan says. We taught and we deal across all the continents. So it's important to know what are the regulations regarding data breaches in those other areas. Does that answer the question, Cliff? So
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, thank you.
So what would be the single biggest enterprise security threat of 2022? Who wants to have a first stab at looking in the cybersecurity glass ball?
Yeah, I don't mind this. Yeah, it's very unpredictable. As we've seen over the last couple of years, cybersecurity attacks and the attackers themselves will try different things. So I mentioned about the low-hanging fruit previously, because that's an easy target for attackers. But when they have to actually think about what they're doing and come up with new attacks and how they're going to accomplish their objectives, depending on what that may be, it's really difficult. So for me, I think the biggest issues that we're going to see this year is continued attack of cloud services, or those services that we thoroughly depend on. So a couple of examples, we had the SolarWinds, which was last year. That was a network management application which a lot of organizations used. We also had the Kaseya one as well, which was a managed service provider, which was hit with ransomware. Again, we've seen that organizations were scurrying, trying to put things right and put those put the controls in place so that their organization, or the risk to their organization, was minimized. So for me, it's about those organizations, those services which are there that you might not necessarily have control over, but you have a dependency and a trust that they are doing the right thing in terms of cybersecurity. And that spans from big organizations all the way down to small organizations. So thinking about cloud services, that sort of thing. I don't know if you Want to add anything, Alan, if you see anything different?
I've got a couple of things I'm going to add, but first, John, do you have a perspective?
I was going to say, Alan, that I think sometimes, and this is where Cliff and I sort of have some really good discussions on this, is that organisations run the risk of concentrating all their resources into the big nation state attack. Now, I know we're talking about the biggest enterprise security threat of 2022, but the one thing that we have seen over the past 12, 18 months is the rise of the good old-fashioned phishing attack. We've seen clients brought to their knees by a phishing email. We spread that out now, where we've got people working off their smartphones from home, they're clicking on links and everything like that. So totally agree, Cliff, with what you're saying about the big nation state attacks or whatever, but I think we need to keep an eye as well on the phishing email, that, you know, somebody who doesn't normally work in that arena has clicked on the link and bang, everything falls apart from there.
Yeah, I think that's right. So my kind of view of 2022 is that there are, broadly speaking, two major themes that organizations need to pay attention to. One is the kind of macro North Korea, Iran, China, Russia making progress against the West through cybercrime, through cyber activity, the possibility of a geopolitical disaster arising in and around Taiwan and in and around Ukraine. Both of those can trigger waves of attacks on critical national infrastructure, waves of attacks on organizations across the West, combined with Iran, North Korea continuing to grow their capability to steal money and compromise particularly financial assets as a way of dealing with the blockade on supply across such a broad range through sanctions. So the ripples and repercussions of that on enterprises and organizations of all sizes is the one direction of attack. The other direction of attack is the hybrid workforce. People are not going to go back to the office anytime soon. I don't think there's going to be a rush of people back into the office. I think 2 years of working from home, many people have kind of concluded that's where they want to be. The generations joining the workforce and in the early stages of progressing through the workforce now kind of have a view that working from home and the benefits of that and the productivities that organizations see come from that kind of means we're not going to get back to the same number of people in the office, which means the very broad attack surface will remain. Lots of organizations don't have proper home working policies. They haven't worked out how to deal with the security threats that come through people using their own devices, and criminals know that stuff. So yeah, I think common phishing attacks, common attacks on compromised assets in the home, man-in-the-middle attacks through people working in coffee bars, all of those kind of things will proliferate. The stuff which one thought might have been a bit low tech a couple of years ago, I think those will be part of the scene through the next year or two. So I think that for organizations, it's much more unpredictable. The very broad attack surface, the much greater range in attackers and attacker skills, supply chain attack. I just think, John, something you said earlier is true. Organizations need to do everything. And that's probably a good way to summarize where we're at. What are the cyber incident response lessons we learned last year? How do companies prepare for those in 2022? Cliff, do you want to lead on that?
Yeah. So this is my area. Absolutely. So what do companies need to have in place for this year? Well, the first is to have a plan. We are still seeing organizations that just don't have a plan before they have a cyber attack. And there's nothing worse than having a cyber attack and then trying to understand what you need to do, because having a cyber incident is a very stressful and time when the organization is really guns blazing trying to get past this incident, and that's not the time that you should be putting these plans together.